Hello, everyone. We're back for our weekly live stream class on Pluto aspects. So today, our class is on Pluto Saturn. We're kind of crossing this threshold right now. Up until Saturn, the planets we've been addressing are more in the personal realm, right? So they move more quickly. All of the planets are personal in the sense that they're in your chart, they're yours. But once we get to Saturn, we're looking at something that we can really think of as more of a cycle. The Pluto-Saturn cycle has its own rhythm. It's something that's a little bit more trackable because Saturn is a 30-year cycle. So, for example, when I was looking at charts, I noticed, well, there are a lot of people born 1982, 1983 with a Pluto-Saturn conjunction and so forth. Pretty much every 40-ish years, more or less, and that's an estimate depending on where they're at, we're going to find a Pluto-Saturn conjunction. So it's not so common, and thus somewhere in the middle of that, we're going to have the Pluto-Saturn opposition. Thus, before I delve into this, I want to just say, from this point onward, Saturn, Uranus with Neptune, we are looking at both something that is relevant for each individual soul on their own evolutionary journey, but also something that symbolizes a collective pulse, right? In transit, in historical developments, the Saturn-Pluto cycle has its own significance. So you might have been born, and that's a personal relevance, but also collectively, these cycles say something. It's fundamentally about these greater transmutational shifts and processes in governance, in order, in structure, in rules. Oftentimes, there are core essential changes that happen on the structural level of the Saturn reality that we're living in. So we're going to look at an example of that from the most recent Saturn-Pluto conjunction, the new cycle that began in the year 2020. So to start, let's define the essence, the basics of what Saturn is all about. And let me just, if you're here, just let me know that you're here. Saturn corresponds to anything that is defined. So we're going to see governments, the rules, the laws, the structures. In any particular society or culture or nation, there are going to be particular rules that say, here's what you have to do, and if you don't, you might get in trouble. From the point of view of that individual unit of that nation, the rules serve the purpose of keeping a sort of order. Of course, we have other dynamics. The very idea of a nation or a country is a border, a boundary set arbitrarily on some land. Right, so obviously life itself, the world itself, from a Neptunian perspective, doesn't have any of these rules. There are no lines dividing countries between one another. So we have the dimension in Saturn where we're establishing the structures for how we live and how we define and thus separate out and say, this is what this is, and this is what this is. If you cross this line, you're in Canada now, and there are different rules in Canada. We also have basic ideas like within each of our lives, if we are following the rules, so to speak, right? You're a good citizen, you pay your taxes, you stop at a green light, that on the most basic root chakra level, you're going to be able to function in society without always needing to struggle. If you drive as fast as you want without following the rules, you might get a ticket or you might get into an accident. So Saturn on this most basic level are the rules and the consequences of breaking the rules. The issue with this is we have a lot of rules and social constructs and judgments in society that aren't necessarily helpful or useful by themselves. Right? We might say it's wrong for women to act this way. It's wrong for men to act this way. All kinds of social constructs, gender constructs, and in different societies or nations, we're going to have the consensus reality that will say, this is the right way to live. This is the right way to behave. Anything that doesn't fit or conform into that, well, there's going to be a Saturn consequence. And Saturn consequences are not just like you get a ticket or you get fined or you get put in jail. On the deeper emotional level, Saturn consequence is you're not regarded as a part of society, right? You're judged, you're shamed. And that's hard from the Saturn perspective. If culture or your group or society or your family, right, or your peer group looks at you and says, you're doing things in a way that is not okay. You're ruining it for everyone. You're not following the rules. You're an outlier. From a Saturn point of view, that doesn't allow us to function in society. And it's very important to appreciate that many of the karmic dynamics that come with Saturn are not just about, where we violate certain boundaries, but where we're conditioned by external judgments and constructs of right and wrong that aren't natural. So one very important thing that Jeff Green taught about Saturn is the difference between natural guilt and conditioned guilt. The natural guilt corresponds to where we violate a boundary or an ethic, right? So letting your children play in the street, right? That's something you shouldn't do. If your dog accidentally runs out of the fence, that should induce within you an awareness of, I gotta make sure I keep the fence closed, because that can be very dangerous. The natural learning of Saturn is the learning of consequence, where we learn to take greater measures and thoughtfulness and awareness of what are the limitations, restrictions, parameters, and boundaries, and ultimately discipline that's necessary to live a grounded life. If I'm not embracing these limitations or these parameters, there's always going to be some sort of issue. And when these boundaries are crossed, there can be great conflict in our own lives. So that should induce a sense of guilt if we violate certain boundaries. Stealing, if we are self-reflective of the energy of stealing, that might induce a sense of guilt. That's not right. I don't feel good about that. I took from someone else. That shouldn't be. No one should get that experience. And we'll want to do better. But we had this very interesting interface between, the society and the rules, and the world out there will say, you did something wrong, so I'm going to put you in jail, or I'm going to give you a consequence. But then a lot of ideas of, you have to be this way, and that might actually push up against our own internal sense of ethics, right? Society might be saying, do this, do that, act in this way, or don't act in this way, but that might not be true for us. So fundamentally, within the Saturn archetype, every soul is learning how to orient according to their own inner authority. And this isn't Uranus. This isn't, it's not like throw all the rules out of the window and do whatever you want. We're part of society. We're part of community. We're part of the country, the nation. We have to be able to incorporate and include ourselves, integrate ourselves within that in some essential way. The key is to be able to be a part of society and not become overly conditioned by it, to the point where we're then no longer in touch with our own inner authority, our own inner guidance system. So the other thing that I want to clarify with Saturn, it's really helpful to recognize, the Saturn archetype both speaks to the elder and the child. The child doesn't know the rules. It doesn't know that if you are going to carry too many plates in your hand, they might break. It doesn't know limitations. It doesn't know the consequence of not brushing your teeth. It doesn't know why it's dangerous to run out into the street by yourself. So for all of us, we come into a Saturn world, government, society, your nation, your peer group, your teachers, and your parents, most importantly, that are going to teach us how to be. They're going to teach us the limitations and the boundaries and the parameters and the consequences. When you act that way, there's going to be a consequence. You can't just do whatever you want to do. Ideally, there's some dimension of consistency and clarity, but and strength in these boundaries, but without the shaming. In the worst case scenario, we have a lot of shame. Like, you're a bad person for doing this, or there's no boundary at all. So children that are raised in a situation where there's an absence of that clear parental guidance, and they're not taught how to discipline themselves. Right? These are two extreme Saturn dynamics, too harsh or lack of any control. As we grow, we need to learn how to navigate this life by ourselves. If you're studying for a test, you need to take the time Saturn, define your time Saturn, limit your extra activities so that you're going to study. And if you don't, you're not going to succeed. Now, you might decide to cheat on the test because from a Saturn point of view, If I'm seeking to achieve a particular goal, the Saturn quickness from an adolescent immature perspective will be, well, what do I need to do to get passing grades? And that's, of course, not ethical, but you can get ahead doing that to a point, right? You might live your life kind of learning how to gain status and succeed and become successful in life through non-ethical means. But that's very different than building a house where the foundational bricks of that house are ethical and in alignment. Saturn's fundamentally all about alignment. And when we're in alignment, our conscience is rested. I'm going to slow down my speech. Oh, Vesta. Okay, one second. Let me get the dog out. And we're not going to find ourselves struggling with always making things work, right? With needing to work very hard to get all the basics. We can be on time. We have all the basics of our life set up, but it takes time. And that's the most important thing. Success and really growing in this life in a good way takes time, takes the cultivation of wisdom to know, where do I want to go? What practices and necessary discipline and thus limitations are necessary in the long haul in order to get to where I want to be in life. So that's Saturn in a nutshell. When Saturn becomes the elder, ideally it's someone who's lived a life living in alignment with the necessary limitations and discipline that's allowed them to grow. And they have a lot of wisdom. There can be a lot of insight. And we can really learn from those that have come before us, that have walked this path. Of course, the key with Saturn is to be able to differentiate between the sort of patriarchal conditioning and shame that sort of creeped in everywhere with the truly helpful guidance and wisdom that we can all live by. And I guess I'll just say one more thing. Maurice Fernandez once made a really brilliant observation that there's a tendency with Saturn to push the rules. Think about children. There's a tendency to push the boundaries. How far can I go before my parents react? Or how can I do this? Are they going to tell me to stop? Right? They're almost like looking out there. Are these authority figures going to catch it and have me not do it? Because if I can get away with it, I'm going to do more of it. If we don't have that internal conscience that says this is not okay, we might just continue going in a certain direction, right? And so we'll push those boundaries with life, right? How far can I go without sleeping? Functioning in the workspace without eating well, or drinking every night and then waking up the next morning and taking, I seem to do just fine. Let me continue to push that, right? That will ultimately create a situation where at some point the foundation simply isn't strong enough and there's going to be a breakdown. And the soul's going to need to work really hard to kind of get themselves into alignment. So very often deep Saturnian processes will reflect at a certain point in a soul's journey where they're going to really focus their will to get into alignment, to discipline themselves where that's been lacking because they've been trying to get ahead quickly. When we link Saturn with Pluto, we're saying an evolutionary theme here, where fundamental evolutionary growth is, it's orienting around one's cultivation of inner authority. The desires of the soul have been oriented around status and self-actualization within society, and being able to derive one's inner authority and ability to navigate in life from the soul itself. And so we're going to have two general extremes manifesting with the Saturn-Pluto archetype. Fundamentally, this is going to speak to very, very deep and generally very challenging evolutionary lessons. It's like the archetypal cannot pass go, must go to jail, must pay a $200 fine. There's a dimension with Saturn-Pluto where we cannot form a relationship to any kind of sense of power and authority and status that takes us out of our essential power. We might for a while, and so that's one dimension where we can find ourselves addicted to social status, being seen, being successful, and will concentrate Pluto on whatever it takes to achieve whatever we perceive Pluto as that object focus of power. Becoming the president, becoming the CEO, making a lot of money, achieving these things, passing the test. The Pluto Saturn dynamic relative to the desire for success or status says, I'm going to do whatever it takes in order to achieve that. And so we can become very manipulative. We can manipulate our way to get ahead. I can sleep with this person to get this promotion, all kinds of ways where it's not in alignment. From that point of view, there's going to come these cyclic points along the soul journey where their own power and status is going to be deeply confronted. When that confrontation occurs, either the soul will feel very victimized by life, right? Feeling like I'm not allowed to get to where I want to go. There are these limits happening that's saying all of a sudden everyone's ganging up against me and, taking away my tenure because I did something inappropriate. That's not okay. Or they're going to become deeply self-reflective. How did I get to this point in life? How is all of this calling me to let go of my addiction to external status and approval, right? And to actually orient from within. Am I in alignment with my own soul? Am I living ethically according to my own inner standard? So the other dimension of Saturn-Pluto then will be souls that are really learning to draw from within themselves a deep commitment to do whatever it takes to achieve their goals in life. And this might mean having some really, really hard lessons. Right? We can come into a parental situation where one parent might have been very shaming, right? Always judging, always judging. Oh, you got an A, and you got an A, but you didn't get an A plus. You do work harder, right? So this is internal conditioning. I'm always feeling disempowered by the authority that's looking at me, judging me and shaming me because I'm never doing a good enough job. And so this soul might be living their life with this internal sense of, I got to make sure I do a really good job, giving their soul away to external authority. Right? Imagine that soul in a relationship. Imagine that soul having a job. They might be deeply sensitive on a deep Plutonian soul level, deeply permeatingly sensitive to any Saturn criticism or judgment coming from the outside. These souls need to learn to do whatever it takes to orient from their own inner authority and weed out, eliminate from their consciousness the addiction to external approval. Because that's where they're not sourcing their own authority from within. Now, in this kind of case, there can be, in that deep sensitivity, the soul can be living their life with a sort of internalized voice that they think is coming from the outside, but it's coming from within. That says, you're bad. You're bad, you're bad, you're bad. You're not doing a good job. You're never doing enough. And they can be attracting experiences where that is reflected back to them, but it's actually pointing back to where internally they are in this process of purging from within their soul this own intense judgment. To the extent that a soul is not willing or ready yet to face their own internalized self-judgment, there might be a defensiveness. I need to make sure that my projection of external authority out there is looking at me in a good way. I want to make sure when the boss is there that I look my best, that I'm approved of. And so they might be constantly seeking to control their reality to be seen in a way that makes them feel approved. So it sustains that status and that social respect, because if I'm not seen that way, that's going to bring up the shame that I haven't actually met yet. And if there is a sense of being judged or shamed, there might be a deep sense of victimization, right? So you can go in sort of two directions here. Doing whatever it takes to make sure that I gain the approval of whatever projected external social figure. And that could be your own spouse or your partner, right? That these dynamics can be projected onto anyone, or even your own children. Or when there is criticism or judgment, feeling deeply victimized. The world is judging me all the time. I'm doing such a good job. I'm working so hard, right? But what's happening underneath that fundamentally is the soul is externalizing their own internal shame and judgment and defending against what they're identifying as external judgment. So it's a way of not claiming responsibility for their own alignment. It's still addicted to this idea of what other people think of me. So from this one angle where the soul is living out this karmic pattern of working out their own internalized shame and judgment, we can have the extreme with Pluto Saturn where they abuse their authority, right? It all points to fundamentally their own relationship to their own soul, but there can be a very strong power dynamic. Do whatever I say. I'm the boss. I gotta make sure I'm in control. And that can come from this fixation on rising the ranks, being powerful, being important. This can express in a family dynamic as a parent, right? Don't you dare negate my own authority. Never question what I tell you to do, right? I'm the authority. And so this soul can be imprinting upon other people, or you can be a boss, or you can be in a relationship with someone, but manifesting this very strong issue with authority. It's the authority complex. Basically, one is needing to maintain this level of control to be the boss all the time. And anything that undermines their authority can easily be seen as pointing to where fundamentally they actually feel this deep internal sense of wrongness that they haven't yet addressed, okay? When we see that manifesting for Pluto Saturn, we'll usually find some level of hypocrisy. So Saturn, from the point of view of hypocrisy, is say as I do, not as say, do as I say, not as I do. Right? There can be a strong pointing the finger and being a sort of moralistic judge of other people, but not necessarily living to that in one's own life. This could be, the senator that's speaking very strongly against certain ideas that are like, oh, that's wrong, but then privately in their own life, they're living that out. It's because they haven't come to terms with their own behavior yet. So another dimension of Saturn-Pluto, besides for the strong external fixation on external approval, can be where there is the need in the face of not getting ahead, in the face of the doors not being open for an individual, the need to apply oneself. Nothing is going to happen for me unless I apply the necessary discipline. And again, we may have karmically certain situations where you can come into an economic situation or social situation, Saturn, where there weren't many opportunities, right? You weren't given a lot of money. You didn't have the opportunity to go to college or to get a job, or in your particular culture, there's a high crime rate, things like that. And the Saturn-Pluto speaks to an underlying deep soul level determination to commit to do whatever it takes to overcome one's lot in life, so to speak, right? To overcome the limited structural reality the soul is born into and achieve something great. And that's going to be a very powerful statement where the will of the soul becomes more powerful than the environment, right? I have no money, no education, but I'm going to wake up every morning really early, put on my best clothes, and do what I can to make a little bit of money. I'm going to invest that. I'm going to go to school. I'm going to, it's like that willpower to achieve long-term goals. And that is a soul that's fundamentally taking full responsibility for their own evolutionary growth. Very often with Saturn-Pluto dynamics, we're going to find a soul that for whatever karmic reasons might manifest a situation where they don't have any handouts. Right? They don't have the support of their family or society to get ahead, and it's relevant for them to really draw upon their own soulful commitment to evolve and orient from their own internal authority in life. But we can have the very opposite extreme, right? That entitlement. You're born into a world or a society or a family where everything is given, and you have the social status, but you didn't need to earn it, right? That can be a very strong challenge from an evolutionary perspective, because the soul might actually not yet have developed the self-reflection to understand natural ethics and alignment. So the thing to understand with Saturn is our karma runs out at a certain point, right? Just like as a child, there's a sort of like, there's an amount of rope that we give them where they can kind of do whatever they want to, but as they get older, there are more boundaries. Like last night, my almost 2-year-old was, having a fit about not getting something. And I thought, okay, it's about time we start letting her have that fit, right? When you're a baby, you really want to just nurture everything completely. That's my view. But as a soul matures, we don't want to give in to every demand. I want this, I need this, right? You're present, you're there, you're holding space, you're not shaming, but you don't say yes and give in to everything. So you have a boundary. No, you're not going to get that right now. And it's very important that the soul is able to kind of process that, right? I'm meeting this boundary. The parental Saturn dimension of my reality is saying, no, I can't have this right now. What am I going to do? Nothing. You can be frustrated. And that's the point. And if we don't learn these boundaries, at a certain point in life, we'll have that entitlement. Life's going to give me whatever I want. I'm going to get whatever I want. I'm going to expect it all to work out. And I don't have to work very hard. I don't have to be ethical. I don't have to think about the consequences of my actions. I don't have to be on time, etc. But that runs out at a certain point when we realize that that isn't always going to work indefinitely. There's a deep empowerment that happens with Pluto Saturn aspects where we essentially eliminate anything that keeps us from the alignment and the necessary discipline that will take us to where we want to go in life. And sometimes dealing with the loss of social approval, the loss of external recognition, is just what we need to actually come back to ourselves. There are some pretty powerful Saturn-Pluto transformation stories where we really have the caterpillar-butterfly situation, right? Someone who's deeply overweight that realizes, if I don't change my habits, if I don't start eating and exercising differently, I'm going to die. Like, my life's going to run out. Saturn. And then from a Pluto perspective, we have this inner knowing there isn't going to be completion here until there's completion. Right? Pluto is, we keep on coming back to play out whatever's resolved within us. So we're going to continue to create time experience to meet whatever internal content we haven't fully integrated. So if I'm just sort of, using up my time until this lifetime runs out, but I'm not using it wisely, I'm just going to be repeating more time experience down the road. So there can be sort of this deeply, this gravity of self-awareness where we realize I'm never going to get anywhere unless I start trying. And that's sort of a no bullshit kind of seriousness that can happen with Saturn and Pluto, where we realize I've been a child my whole life. I've been, doing whatever I want to do, or not following boundaries or limitations, not accepting the necessity for discipline. And I'm never going to get anywhere until I apply that. And when that's realized, when a soul really takes that full responsibility to commit to do what's necessary to get to where they want to go in life, that's a powerful change. Because they're no longer looking on the outside. What does the world think of me? What do my projections of external authority figures look at me? I'm looking at it myself from within. I'm the only one judging myself. And that's where there's a great ability to fail with Saturn and Pluto. To take one's failures, to take where one feels disempowered or stuck, or I have to work so hard just to get somewhere in life, but other people don't have to work as hard, right? From different gender or social economic, right? And to not be victimized by that. And say, what does this say about me? What do I need to do to get to where I want to go? And on a deeper level of self-reflection, it's important for Saturn and Pluto to really ask themselves, why do I want to even go there? We watched this film recently. I forgot what it was called. It was a cartoon about this lady that, very Saturn and Pluto, had a concentrated, single-focused desire to become a ballet artist, right? Professional ballet dancer. She even had this picture, this image of this great place in France where she can study ballet. And she was an orphan, had no money, and she managed to get herself there. She lied so that she wasn't ethical. All of that fell apart. And then she had to come back, but from an ethical place where the sincerity of her willingness to do the hard work ultimately paid off. There's another character in that film who her mother bought her way into the school. She was practicing ballet very, very hard all day, but she didn't want to be a dancer. It wasn't in her soul. She wanted to succeed, and she was very competitive, but because she internalized the conditioning, the stress, the judgment, the pushing of her very domineering mother that said, you must, I remember when I was in elementary school, there was this one person in my school whose mother was set on her going to Harvard. Like, how can you have such an ambition for your child to achieve something without really having that space to reference the soul's path? How do you know what that soul's path is? So we could have that Saturn dynamic where we're told, you gotta be this. And so for that girl who is practicing really hard, I need to be approved of, I need to be approved of, I need to be improved of. If we ask souls in that kind of situations where they're seeking approval from that external authority that's saying, work really hard, do this. Why do you want to become what you want to become? Why are you working so hard? There might be a lot of answers, right? Like, oh, because all these beliefs and ideas as to why this is important. But if you dig deeply enough, it's because then I will receive the approval of my mother or my father, right? I will be respected. Society will like me. Or I'll have the security and the comfort and the insurance policy and the retirement fund saved up that I was told I need in order to be a happy and fulfilled person. So if you look deeply enough, it might be a vessel with nothing inside, an empty shell. It's not really a commitment from their soul. And that's going to build a lot of stress. And usually if we're trying to sustain something that's very repressive, that we need to become and achieve, we're going to feel very threatened by people that are more free. And usually we'll need to reaffirm these judgments and these rules in order to sustain our persistence within them. But there might come a point where a soul just sort of walks away from all that actually isn't indigenous to their own soul. I don't want to do this. I don't want to work so hard to become something that I don't really care about. So establishing one's own self-authority, learning how to establish goals in life and to work really hard for them because I care about it. I really want to do that. And that's the key with Saturn, Pluto. Fundamentally, if we're coming from our own soul path, the intention is to do whatever is necessary in alignment to grow and to strengthen ourselves accordingly. Saturn is about strengthening. And I've spoken about this with Mars. There's a very natural relationship between Saturn and Mars, right? Mars corresponds to our instinctive actions, but we always want to think of Mars relative to Saturn because really everything that we do has a long-term consequence. So when we're looking at Saturn, Pluto, we also intuitively think about what's going on with Mars. Just naturally. We can do this with all of the planets. Because it's going to say, I have to repress certain urges and learn how to train and discipline myself with respect to my long-term goals. Otherwise, I'm not going to get there. I want to say one more thing. Just the significance of really not giving our soul away to the devil. Saturn's the devil, Saturn is the promise of fame and recognition and money and more YouTube likes and more Instagram views, whatever society holds as a measure of success. So we can concentrate Pluto Saturn on getting all of that, but we can easily become entrapped and entangled by the addiction to that. So it's very important within Saturn Pluto that in a sense we're also letting go of our addiction to that and we're focusing on who am I becoming. What is my personal, spiritual, professional, social goal that I need to reference from within myself? Because all of those things will come and go. Social recognition, someone can publish an article about something you said or did when you were 18, and then suddenly you're canceled. and no one wants to talk to you. No one buys your book, or they unsubscribe. Like, social respect and status can come and go just like that. And it's easy, right? The fruits of past actions can easily come forward in the present moment. Everything can be taken away. So cycles of that are really important to dishonor. This is the impermanence of all things in this world. Time and space and form and society, all of these things don't provide your power. Your power comes from within your soul itself. So let me look at my notes here, see if there's anything else. I think there's an important piece here when we think about the conditioning of society that says, be this, do this, act this way. These are the appropriate ways to behave. We might find ourselves needing to say no in the face of these judgments. I am going to walk this path. I am going to embrace my identity. I am affiliating with a political party that my parents don't affiliate with. I'm going to be judged, but I'm going to live according to that. I'm going to embrace my gender identity. I'm going to embrace the career that I want to embrace. And it's not just like a Jupiter speaking your truth, it's a Saturn. I'm not going to feel shame about the life that I'm living and the structural reality that I'm creating. And if your government saying, hey, do these things, the Saturn-Pluto dimension very, very often is the necessary introspection, self-reflection, very deep, 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 deep self-reflection. Can't emphasize this enough. That says, I'm being asked to do these things, or my relationship or my boss, right, or government are expecting these things of me. Is this aligned with my own inner ethic? When do I need to say, I'm not going to do this and I'll accept the consequences, versus I am going to do this because the consequences won't be supportive to where I'm trying to go in life? That's a very delicate Saturn-Pluto dynamic. I pay taxes. Do I support everything my taxes are doing? No. Am I interested in the consequences of not paying taxes? No. Right? So each soul has to kind of navigate that internal ethical dynamic for themselves on their own soul journey. Fundamentally, we're responsible for where we're going in life and our own choices and the consequences of those choices. The deepest teaching of Saturn and Pluto is that no one is a victim. We don't always have the grasp of the deeper karmic dimensions underneath the material appearance of our incarnation. And this is never about, oh, you deserve this, this, and that. But fundamentally, everything is relevant for the soul's evolutionary journey. I know of someone, I know it's okay to speak about this particular chart dynamic. Usually I wouldn't if I didn't know it was okay. With a very strong Saturn-Pluto 9th house dynamic. And Mars is also there, and they're all retrograde. This reflects for this soul, it's Saturn, Mars, Pluto, retrograde in Leo in the 9th house. Right? This particular individual has had past lives of being a very powerful leader and teacher, and having wielded a lot of power, and was actually very much, listen to me, I'm the authority and I'm right. In this particular lifetime, they had a social experience growing up in their own home where their father was that. Their father was narcissistic and abusive. And so they grew up in a situation where they weren't seen. Right? This is not punishment, but from an evolutionary perspective, what's the purpose here? What is that inducing for that individual soul? To learn how to reference their own authority and their own knowing from within themselves. Not being so concerned on, I need you to respect me. That was stripped away from them in order to support their ongoing journey of actually arriving, clarifying their own soul authority from within. And everyone's journey is different. The nuances and the reasons for why we have different experiences has to be understood on an individual level. In fact, with Saturn and Pluto, it's incredibly helpful to be able to understand in a compassionate and loving way, how are the individual person's soul experiences, life context supporting? If a person comes to me in a session and they are demonstrably self-reflective and they want to know what can they do to evolve, that tells me that they're already at a point where they're able to internalize the struggles and the limitations of their life experience and use it in a way to evolve and actually claim their strength and self-responsibility to become a greater version of their soul potential. If someone comes to me and they're stuck in this victimization, feeling way down or judged by life, I'm going to have to work with where they're at, and to whatever extent it feels supportive, maybe help them unravel the reality of their own internalized judgments and help point them back to themselves. We're all going to be where we're at. But there's a next step in our own evolutionary growth. And fundamentally, Saturn says you are responsible for the choices that you're making in life and the discipline and the necessary effort that you're exerting in life to get to where you need to get in life. It's not just going to happen for you if you don't try. Okay, let's look at some questions and then we'll look at some really, really interesting examples. As always, retrograde planets, and I do recommend for everyone check out my retrograde class series. You can buy the whole series or just individual classes on each individual planet. Saturn retrograde in general can point to one of two dynamics. Always look at it in context. There wasn't adequate attention being brought to the necessary limitations and discipline. And so that retrograde is going to induce or reflect for that soul where they're really going within to reflect on, doing whatever I want isn't working. And they're going to become hyper-focused and thus accelerate their own self-reflection around the necessary discipline. Or there's too much shame, rigidity, control, and they're overly conditioned by these external forms and constructs, and they need to unravel that. Or they'll need to really decondition from this strong pressure to be something that is just an empty form. To see it in context, but fundamentally, the Saturn retrograde will have the effect of accelerating the soul's evolutionary journey through deeper self-reflection. And that can be hard. I mean, we can be facing experiences where it's like, oh man, why am I creating this? What's really going on here? In general, just to appreciate that, if Saturn is conjunct Pluto, and if Saturn's retrograde, Pluto will also be retrograde. If Saturn is opposite Pluto, one of them will be retrograde, one of them will be direct. It's just really interesting to think about how these things come together. Okay. Pluto, the planet of cancel culture. Well, I would say Saturn is the planet of cancel culture. Saturn is, look at what this person said. It's all about judgment, right? Saturn says society at any particular moment, in any particular culture, has their rights and their wrongs. So, for example, as more and more awareness is growing around how women are treated, more and more men in authority and positions of power are being called out for things they've said or things they've done, right? But then Saturn also corresponds to judgment and how society will really relate to and treat people. How do we deal with people when they've made a mistake, right? We put them in jail if they've done something illegal. What does the jail system do? It's all about what are the limitations and the rules and the structures that are being set in place that fundamentally have the actual purpose of leading to a rehabilitation. When the consequences don't lead to rehabilitation, it's just shaming. It's just, you're bad. You're wrong. So that's a big issue with cancel culture. We call out these people, but what structures are in place to help for the rehabilitation of where people have violated natural ethics and boundaries? That's where we have to understand that wherever we experience that wall that says, nope, in whatever form or way of life, it says you can't go further. The higher way of dealing with that is to reflect, okay, I'm stuck here, I'm limited here, metaphorically or literally, I'm in jail, which means my limited motions here. Like, I can't do whatever I want to do. There's a limitation. How can I use this to grow and become self-aware? All jails have a sentence. Even if it's life, that's a sentence. You'll have your next incarnation, right? Like, all limitations have their sentence. They end at a certain point. The key is to use them wisely. If you didn't pass your grades and you have to stay for summer school, you have the summer to amend the mistakes you made during the school year so that you don't have to repeat it. That's Saturn. And then Saturn, Pluto can be a soul that's really going deeply to claim their own authority from within and might be dealing with deepest levels of disempowerment relative to where there's attachment. So a Saturn-Pluto example of cancel culture would be where on a psychological level, the shaming or the being, pushed out of society produces within the soul a deep sense of victimization or disempowerment. And this is actually one thing to point out here. Many souls with Saturn and Pluto have dealt with issues like suicide or sort of any form of not using the container and the time structure of this incarnation usefully or wisely. And it just means you're going to have to come back and repeat. You got to do it over again until you learn the lesson. There can be such a deep sense of shame of being pushed out that on a deep soul level, Pluto, we're going to want to completely, it's like going into our Plutonian shell of jadedness and fear and hurt. That we just distrust life. We don't want to try, we don't want to participate, we don't want to make any more effort. Or we just give up and we'll just start living a life of crime or doing whatever we want, right? There can be a lot of very dark, and we'll see an example of this, very, very dark responses to being limited in life if we're not willing to say, okay, this is pushing me back to my soul. I got to take responsibility for this. Okay. Great. Let's look at some really interesting examples. O.J. Simpson, okay? He actually just left this world recently, so I'm like, cool. Let's take a look at this guy's chart. Well, Pluto Saturn conjunction in Leo in the 12th house. It's actually a balsamic conjunction, so Saturn's completing a cycle. Squares Jupiter in Scorpio in the 3rd house. Let me just say, Saturn, Pluto in the 12th in Leo. Okay, I'll give a context. His father was gone by the age of 4. He was raised by his mother. So oftentimes Saturn in the 12th can be like the absence of that sort of, that parental, patriarchal figure from that point of view of the boundaries, right? So a lack of healthy, appropriate boundaries. Saturn, Pluto in Leo in the 12th can be the extreme of narcissism. I'm going to do whatever I want because I'm determining myself to be entitled to do it, and I can get away with it. Right? I'm greater than God. And of course, you can become this great icon. He was a great athlete. He was rewarded all these MVPs and achieved these feats that others haven't achieved in football. So he was a very strong, well-respected, athletic icon. Saturn, Pluto in Leo in the 12th house. But the limitations of his own soul evolutionary journey had to do with ethics and boundaries and alignment. The square to Pluto, in my view, and this is also a good example of a Pluto-Jupiter square, was lying. And the ability, Jupiter in the 3rd, to tell a good story, to be convincing, duplicitous, and to be deceitful is the 12th house. In fact, deception is a 12th house thing. Of course, we never know. I personally suspect, I think most people suspect that he did, murder the 2 people that were killed, but he was acquitted. Several years later, he was put in jail, I think, for 7 years for an armed robbery. But even that, just for 7 or so years. And he eventually went out of jail. He had this series called Juiced, where he would pull pranks on people. It was like the strangest series. Like the intro to this series would have him like dancing with actually naked women or topless women. Like very explicit. And then in these pranks, he was like, one prank he's pretending to be a fast food worker and he like rubs the meat on his shirt, and then in each prank he's like, you've been juiced, I'm really O.J. Simpson, selling a Bronco, which many people know he was running away from the crime scene in a Bronco at a used car agency, selling a Bronco to this person. It's like very odd to be making fun or light of these issues. He wrote a book, or it was ghostwritten, but it was a series of interviews with him called If I Did It. The book was a sort of way of admitting to the murders, but without actually saying I did it. It's like, here's a story of everything that happened from the point of view of if I actually did it. It's twisted, right? This is an extreme narcissistic, and I think that's one of the ways of him, in my sense of it, dealing with his own guilt, his own conscience of, I did it, but I'm not going to admit that I actually did it. So yeah, this is a great example. And just to point out too, this world that we live in doesn't promise justice on the level. Like, bad people or people that do wrong things aren't always going to be caught. They're not always going to, get human social justice. They have their own karmic journey, and that's going to stay with them. But we know bad things do bad people. Bad people do many bad things, and they get away with it. But to a point. Like, you can't ride any karmic wave indefinitely and forever, because all of it's grounded in sort of this illusion of the ego being more powerful than truth. And that just doesn't last forever. And this is a part of the soul field where they will continue to create experiences to reflect back to them their own inner reality. And if they have that desire within them, there is that potential to begin to take responsibility for that, if that's something that they're wanting to do. Okay, let's look at the next chart. I actually was curious to look at the lawyer, Johnny Cochran. So, if you're not familiar with the whole O.J. Simpson trial, you probably know the general of it, right? So who was the lawyer that got him to win the case, right? Where was his Saturn Pluto? Oh, well, look at that. We don't have the birth time, okay? So I made it an Aries ascendant. But look at this. Saturn, so don't ignore the houses here, okay? Saturn is in Aries, squaring Mars in Capricorn. So that's very ambitious, right? I'm going to make this work. I'm going to win. I'm very ambitious. Trining, you can't tell because it's out of sign, but this is a trine, very tight trine, in fact, just a little over a degree, to Pluto at the very end of Cancer, almost in Leo. So that's where, the trines with Saturn and Pluto can also easily symbolize you can easily get away with things without necessarily applying the adequate introspection and self-reflection around, is this right? Is this ethical? Is this aligned, right? And I think this is just very revealing too with that Saturn-Mars square. Again, Mars and Capricorn ruled by Saturn. In fact, Mars and Pluto are also in conjunct. This is a very ambitious energy that worked really hard, had a really strong focus of will to achieve the legal results that he ultimately got. It's interesting to see that. All right, Sinead O'Connor. Also, she recently passed. Amazing artist and musician. She was known for this profound Saturday Night Live performance where she covered this Bob Marley song on war and then took the picture of the Pope and ripped it. This is the true evil, right? This is the true enemy. Of course, she has Pluto with Uranus in Virgo 9, which speaks so much to like the hypocrisy of the church and all with that square to Sagittarius as well. I did actually a really good talk on Uranus and the nodes of Uranus where I use her example. You can check it out on the Jeffrey Wolf Green AEA.org website. I went really deeply into this Uranus, but just looking at this Pluto-Uranus here, obviously her core evolutionary journey has been about claiming her truth in the face of Judeo-Christian cosmology and hypocrisy that's seeking to disempower. She spoke out about the sexual abuse of children in the church and how the church was lying and hiding that. So the speaking out part relative to the structure of authority of the church. Saturn in Pisces in the third house, right? I'm speaking and I'm pointing out the hypocrisy and the lack of ethics in the church. And these are words people like, stop talking. Don't rip the Pope's picture. Stop saying what you're saying. She was using her own status and power and authority as a popular singer to speak out against these social issues. And the tension of that Pluto-Saturn dynamic is there's a need to claim one's own authority in the face of where society might be saying that's wrong or that's bad or we're going to disapprove of you, right? wherever we're entangled in any kind of addiction or pattern of entanglement with any kind of external structure in life or person, the need is to claim our own authority. And oftentimes we're going to find ourselves pushed back and forth between giving ourselves over to something that doesn't feel aligned with us, right? Selling our soul, to I'm going to be myself and true to myself no matter what the consequences. I don't care if I'm judged, if they take away my stripes and my banners and my card and I can't pass go and I can't cross. Like the need to really claim and do this deep work to strengthen and know one's authority from within is often very highlighted with Saturn Pluto. I should say too, some of the most extreme cases of corrupt and dark behavior also come from Saturn Pluto. And we know she struggled with depression, right? She struggled with a deep sense of alienation, not getting her voice out. And I would say a big part of that Saturn Pluto lesson, what can I constructively, Saturn, do long term to bring about the purpose that I'm here to live out? It does take a lot of effort and really drawing upon a deeper strength and resiliency within. She really struggled with getting her voice heard, but one of her amazing qualities was her being true to herself, always speaking her truth, not afraid of what people thought of her. And she really struggled, though, I think, with a lot of depression and struggling to fit in life. So she's a great example of a Saturn-Pluto aspect. Mark David Chapman, okay? He is the man that murdered John Lennon. And what's really interesting, I was looking on Wiki, every few years, he's in jail, he comes up for parole and it's denied. And the reason is they don't yet feel there's adequate self-awareness or self-reflection of what he did and why he did it, and that there's adequate change, right? That him being released would be helpful enough. And like the statements that I read are oftentimes, what you've done taking a life and the great effects it's had on his family and the world, it's not liable for you being let out of jail, right? You did this and here's the consequence and you're still in jail. It's a Saturn thing. He's still playing out some kind of karma. The core dynamic, as I understand it, was he was so disempowered and angry at John Lennon saying the Beatles are more important than Jesus, or in one of his lyrics, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in the Beatles, I only believe in me and Yoko. Something like that. To me, this is the signature of someone that maybe was giving his power away to a sort of social or spiritual or religious icon, and then felt betrayed and abandoned by that icon when the views of that icon were contrary to what this soul believed. Mark Chapman was highly influenced by Christian theology and felt really disempowered and really abandoned, I would say, when John Lennon, spoke in the way that he did around Jesus. And I think there's also a dimension of seeing the hypocrisy, which can often be a ninth house thing, but also a Saturn thing, right? Ninth house is just you're lying, pretending to be something that you're not. And then Saturn is, you talk about all the social structures of life, but you have like a lot of money and you have a lot of property. Seeing what he identified as hypocrisy relative to John Lennon's lavish lifestyle and just feeling deeply disempowered by it. Maybe he felt really small. Maybe Mark felt like he couldn't get to where he wanted to in life, and he felt very victimized by that. So you can really see to sort of the anger and the rage and the disempowerment and the possibility of feeling deeply betrayed by the views and beliefs and the lifestyle of John Lennon, leading to that victimization and that desire to take revenge. And he apparently had on his list other famous people that he was considering doing this to as well. So that's a really good example here. Dave Chappelle, honorable mention. I just noticed it. Saturn on the South Node, square Pluto. I mean, I don't know much about him, but he speaks a lot about the hard work he's done to get to where he's gotten in his own career. And of course, a lot of what he speaks to has to do with political, social judgments and constructs, and kind of pushing through and beyond them. Tina Turner, this is a great example. This is also a square. This is a disseminating phase square. Again, Saturn on the South Node, she was in that relationship with Ike. She had to claim her own authority, her own power, and draw upon a deeper trust and faith. I'm going to leave and be out there on my own and not have that guidance. I'm not depending on Mike, who's making me famous, who gave me these advances, but is also taking my power away. And this is the other expression of Pluto and Leo in the 12th, where you're reflecting someone else's light and you're not empowered from within your own soul. I need to claim my own soul path and claim my own journey and walk my own journey, not depend on it to be given to me by someone else. So the power and the strength to walk her own path and trust her own soul is very strongly implied in the Saturn-Pluto square. So I want to speak to the year 2020. And this is what I mentioned in the beginning, where we have these Saturn-Pluto cycles. I think the last Saturn-Pluto cycle prior to 2020, I imagine, was in the 80s, right? The last time Pluto and Saturn came together. And that would have been when Pluto was in Libra and Saturn was in Libra. So what was happening during 2020, that whole year, and this really emphasized itself later in the year, Saturn actually entered Aquarius and then went retrograde back into Capricorn and joined Pluto once more during the second half of 2020. This is where, especially in the United States, there were a lot of protests around the institutionalized racism, the whole thing around George Floyd being murdered by a police officer in the street, and the immense amount of outrage around society and structure and racism. Like, that was the social trend and the theme of that time. Even so much so that for a while during COVID, the protests almost like it kind of like went above COVID for a moment, where people were protesting in the streets, even in the middle of the pandemic, where people were supposed to be socially isolating, distancing themselves, and all that kind of stuff. Like, we have this collective opening where we're called to kind of look into the corruption of society, the structures, the powers that be, and say we have to evolve how we're living. We have to evolve the status quo, the structural realities that we've been living by that have been oppressive to us. So we can really find that strongly in Saturn-Pluto cycles. And of course, anyone with strong Saturn-Pluto in your chart, oftentimes, depending on your evolutionary stage and your unique karmic experience, there might be a very strong sense of, I gotta fight the man, right? It's not ultimately necessarily about fighting the man, because we can get lost in that, right? We can get lost in seeking to change something on the outside. Ultimately, and this is going to be according to each soul's evolutionary program and what they're needing. It's important to understand that. It's about, what can I do to claim my own self-authority and where I want to get in life? What actions and discipline and path do I need to take and choose? Does that mean, here's one more example I want to give. Does that mean to make changes by the society and government that I'm feeling disempowered by, that I need to run for political office, right? Do I need to actually work harder to actually make a change? Or does it mean stepping away from politics and going into my soul, right? And looking at, what can I really work on within myself, and letting go of trying to change the outside. One isn't better than the other. They're just two different expressions that might be relevant for different souls in different ways at different times, according to the program. Okay, so let me look back at any questions here. Could you speak a bit more about the Pluto Saturn balsamic for each EA stage? Let me let my dog in. So let's just speak about it generically. Saturn Pluto balsamic is going to say a cycle's coming to close. So on the one hand, there's going to be a deep degree of self-reflection and insight into the entire cycle that came before. And there can be this deeper existential sense of, I can't quite just go forward the way that I want to, because something has to complete. With Saturn Pluto balsamic, there are going to be very strong limitations and karmic requirements that the soul has to play out. Whatever that is, it's like you have to deal with these issues to bring the cycle to closure. And inside, that's known. That might be resisted, and there might be a sense of victimization or feeling a sense of powerlessness, a lack of control in life. But ultimately, that needs to be fully addressed. for many souls, and I'm not going to speak to, because you have to look at this in context, right? So any of these things can manifest very different ways at every evolutionary stage. But let's just say, in consensus stages, that might be, I've been working very hard to start my own business, and that Saturn Pluto for that individual soul might say, you're going to have to really go the long route and finish your training, finish your schooling, accept the limitations of your life, and do whatever is necessary to get ahead, right? It could be you are a spiritual practitioner, and that Saturn Pluto from the point of view of our own personal habits, our own conditioning, might say, really know your long-term goals. What is your daily discipline? You might want to already be somewhere, but you're not there yet. So really self-reflect. What do you need to commit to? And Saturn, there might be a lineage. There might be elders or traditions or lineages to merge with Pluto, to osmose, and then to fully take in. This can express in all kinds of ways. And to differentiate that with the new phase, the simple difference is new phase says now we're starting a new cycle, and what are the necessary actions and choices that I need to make in order to initiate this new cycle? And I can't just ignore that. I need to move forward in a new direction. Both can be very difficult. Both require a lot of work. Okay, thank you everyone for joining me. We're going to come back next week for our second to last talk on this series, which is Pluto Uranus. Reminder that I am available for intuitive guidance sessions, both for individuals, also for couples. I'm also available for long-term soul-to-soul companionship sessions. This is for anyone that wants to work with me over a longer period of time to create more of a soul continuity. I also have a training program. Enrollment officially closed now, but you can enroll in the training program for the self-study version at any time of the year, and you have all of the content, all of the curriculum available, as well as many individual classes available. You could also jump in at any point in a future live program cycle. So you can check all of that in the description below. Okay, everyone, thank you for joining. Till next time.